Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and students of history. This is Miss Gooding, and I am talking to you today about D-Day, a very significant and turning point during World War II, and it took place on June 6th of 1944. To orient ourselves a little bit, here is the country of France, here is the English Channel, up here to the north is England, here is Normandy, where the Allied forces landed, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the beaches of Normandy. There were a couple specific purposes for D-Day. As you recall, Hitler had moved into most of the surrounding countries around Germany. And so D-Day was to liberate France and also to take back the French coastline. There were three main allies that were involved in D-Day: the United States, Britain, and Canada versus Germany. Between the years of 1942 and 1944, Hitler spent a lot of time and effort reinforcing the Atlantic Wall. And so in this map, you can see this yellow line. And so 6 million mines were planted along the coast to protect Europe from the Atlantic side. The beaches were also lined with barbed wire. Steel spikes and large logs were also put in shallow waters to injure boats or slow them down. There were also concrete bunkers put along the coast in order for the German army to be able to see ships that may be arriving along the Atlantic coast. And these bunkers were linked by trenches. And so the Atlantic Wall really definitely protected and fortified Hitler and his army. There was a lot of discussion before D-Day about where the Allies should actually land. And it makes sense that they would have landed and left from Dover and landed in a city called Calais. And Calais is in France because it's the shortest distance. And this is what Hitler assumed was going to happen. Plus, we did a little bit of trickery. But this was kind of the common sense place that people thought that the United States, Canada, and Britain would be landing. However, a more complex plan was put into place, and that the goal here was to get all of the Allied troops to land here in Normandy. And the beaches were Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Dwight Eisenhower, who was the American general at this time, made sure and shipped all sorts of supplies, including tanks and planes and boats and trucks, to these various places in England to make sure that they could actually go across with the soldiers. He also made sure that there were enough soldiers sent to Britain to be a part of D-Day, and so over 1 million American soldiers were sent to Britain. D-Day was top secret, and in fact, the Allies set up a fake army base in Dover to really fake out Hitler. And so, as you recall, I just mentioned that the most common place that people thought the Allies were going to leave from is Dover, and they would have landed in this town of Calais. However, they chose to leave from this area and then transport all of their supplies and soldiers to the beaches down here on the coast of France. But in order to fake out the Nazis, a fake army base was built in Dover. And so they had fake tanks made out of rubber. They actually had recordings of clanking tanks so that spies nearby would actually hear that there was something going on in Dover. Fake tire tracks. I mean, these people went all out to try and fake Hitler's army out. Not only did they have fake tire tracks, but they actually had painted canvas over wooden frames that looked like jeeps and trucks and ships and planes in Dover. And U.S. General George Patton, who's a really well-known figure in history, was led this make-believe army, right? And so it was really believable. Newspapers also ran stories about Patton visiting troops, and radio broadcasts were sharing false news. And the bluff worked. And Hitler sent troops to Calais rather than to down here along Normandy. At the very beginning of this plan, D-Day was actually scheduled for June 5th of 1944, but there was a storm approaching. And the storm started on June 3rd, a couple days before, and so it set the plan back a few days. And lots of discussions were happened between the generals, but they decided to actually move it back a day and to actually attack during a break in the weather set for June 6th of 1944. And so, in preparation for the June 6th attack, the Allies bombed the Atlantic Wall to try to open it up a little bit, and also took down many German aircraft, especially the bombers, that would have made it more difficult for the Allies to actually do their work. On the very, very early morning and night of June 6th, there were 20,000 paratroopers that planned to be transported by airplane and land a little bit inland in Normandy. These guys carried about 200 pounds of supplies, including food and water and ammunition and all sorts of things. They parachuted in at night. And because of the weather, though, hardly any of these guys landed in the correct places. So some of them ended up in the English Channel. Some of them, unfortunately, drowned because they had so much stuff on their bodies and they weren't able to actually swim to shore. Some people landed a little bit too far inland and they landed in farms. Some of them landed on top of buildings. And it was a very, very dangerous kind of thing to do. 1 in 5 were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. But they were very instrumental in making sure that Normandy was attacked from all angles, right? So these guys were supposed to attack from the inland. There was also a very complicated and complex fight by sea. So 156 soldiers landed at Normandy by sea. And they landed, like I said before, at 5 different beaches along the coast of Normandy. And so the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword were the beaches. Okay, and I'm going to specifically spend a little bit more time talking about Omaha, because this one was the most complex and the one that was not quite as successful at first as the other 4. The soldiers' experience landing at Normandy was, let's just say, it was pretty rough. Okay, they were taken in by large ships and destroyers, and these ships and destroyers stopped about 12 miles from shore, where the soldiers then unloaded from these larger ships and boarded landing boats. And you can see a picture of a landing boat here. The landing boats had no seats. They had to travel inland for 12 miles, and so a lot of these soldiers got extremely seasick. And because of the storm, a lot of these boats started to fill with water. And so soldiers had to use their helmets in order to scoop water out and throw it back overboard. But it was a rough sailing to Normandy. So once the soldiers got ashore, bombs were dropping. But due to the clouds, these bombs were missing their targets, and they were friendly, right? So these bombs were supposed to be hitting the Atlantic Wall, and they were supposed to be hitting, various targets to help these soldiers move inland from the beaches. Well, because of the storm and the clouds, these bombs were not landing correctly, which complicated things for the landing soldiers. And by the way, 13,000 bombs were dropped in preparation. Anyway, also the tanks that were coming across, you guys, it was amazing that they prepared these tanks to be kind of pseudo ships. I think I have a picture. Yes, here's a picture. So they also had these tanks that tried to make it inland from these destroyers and larger ships. And you can see that these tanks had these rubberized kind of, I don't know, skirts on them to make them into pseudo boats. Well, they didn't work very well. So I believe that they had like close to 30 of these tanks that they were planning on making it to shore before the soldiers in order to open up the Atlantic Wall, make it safer for the soldiers. However, very few of these tanks actually made it to shore because of, tanks are heavy, guys. And also in the storm, A lot of them capsized or filled with water and sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic or of the English Channel. And so they didn't make it to shore. I think I heard maybe two of them actually made it to shore. And so they really weren't there in time to open up the Atlantic Wall. Here are some more images of once the soldiers landed from these landing boats. You can see kind of what they had to actually go through. Some of these landing boats, they got stuck on some of the Atlantic Wall. You remember those big logs and steel rods that were kind of in the shallower parts of the water. And so some of the soldiers ended up having to jump off of these landing boats. And unfortunately, because of all of their supplies that they had on their bodies, they ended up drowning some of them. Some of them, when they made it to shore, they were greeted at Omaha. They were greeted by soldiers shooting from above the cliffs because there were cliffs at Omaha. And so soldiers in their bunkers were able to see Nazi soldiers were shooting down at these arriving soldiers. And so really some of them never made it out of the landing boats. It was a disaster all around at first. Okay. Here is a picture of kind of, I believe this is Omaha as well, and kind of how much activity there was at the time. This was later on, obviously, or maybe right after, because the destroyers here are lining the shores, and they did not get instructions to move up to the shores until later on June 6th. And I'll get to that in just a second. More about Omaha Beach. Again, this was the most difficult beach to navigate. Twice as many Allied troops were sent there because they were prepared. Omaha Beach actually had, like cliffs. The tanks didn't arrive as planned, like I've already told you. The German forces were able to fire at soldiers from bunkers atop cliffs, like I've already mentioned. So they aimed directly at the landing boats as ramps were lowered, and unfortunately, some of these soldiers never really were able to leave the landing boats. They were shot and killed immediately. And not only like if soldiers were able to get off of these ships, they then had to navigate mines and the barbed wire and the steel beams that the tanks were supposed to have taken care of, but didn't because the tanks didn't make it to shore. Good stuff. But there were a couple of Omaha Beach heroes that I want to talk about because Omaha Beach, regardless of how messy and how horrible it was for the soldiers at first, it actually ended up being a successful endeavor. So one of the heroes that really made an impact that day, his name was First Lieutenant William Moody. At 7:30 in the morning on June 6th, Moody and about 25 other soldiers were hiding at the bottom of the cliffs at Omaha Beach. And he realized, we're being shot at, but there's got to be a way to get to the top of these cliffs in order to do something about the Germans that are spraying, all sorts of ammunition down at the Allied troops. And so Moody recruited a couple of the other guys to hike along the cliff to look for a way up. Well, they found a spot to do so. And it was a kind of a crack in the cliff. And he used his bayonet and his physical strength to climb 30 meters up this cliff. And so about 100 feet. And so they scaled up this cliff, and these Moody and these three other guys, maybe it was a total of three, reached the top. And while doing so, they avoided landmines and they avoided being shot, and they did so without being seen. And so from the top, they then started to drop ropes so that other soldiers following them could actually scale up the wall a little bit more easily using these ropes. And then from there, these men were able then to enter the bunkers and fight the Germans in hand-to-hand combat, which definitely did a couple of things. Number one, it distracted the Germans from shooting down upon the beaches. And number two, it allowed the Allies to get a little bit more further inland and then to fight from that perspective rather than just huddling on the beaches. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Moody, after his brave actions, he later died that day. But he is remembered as a D-Day hero. Another guy that was known as a D-Day hero was General Norman, also known as Dutch Coda. A little bit later in the morning, at 9:30 a.m., um, General Coda was out in one of the major ships, and he realized that a lot of the men at Omaha were stuck on the beaches. And so he decided to wade in, and he strapped on some ammunition, he got some weapons, smoking a cigar, he dashed down the beach to motivate these men to start climbing the cliffs. And so he rallied them by saying, "Hey, gentlemen, we're being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." All right, kind of not a real motivating factor, but hey, we're dying anyway, so why don't we die doing something beneficial? All right, so he helped the men through the barbed wire that was kind of cutting them off from the cliffs, and he then urged them up the bluffs in order to fight the enemy closer. So he was another person that ended up helping D-Day be successful, especially at Omaha. We know that the Allies won D-Day. D-Day was exceptionally successful. Not at first, I mean, there were a ton of casualties, but the Allies did win. So eventually, the destroyers, those big ships, were given orders to pull closer to the beach. And once they pulled closer, especially to Omaha Beach, they were able to use their cannons in order to fire and to destroy the German fortresses that were up on the tops of the beaches, okay, on the tops of the cliffs. Soldiers were also able that day to get atop the cliffs in order to attack German bunkers and trenches, like I've already talked about, and First Lieutenant William Moody helped that. And by 1:30 p.m., the Allies gained control of Omaha Beach. And by evening, D-Day had virtually ended, and the Allies had taken control of the beaches. So all 5 beaches had been won by the Allies. The Allied soldiers began immediately liberating French cities and towns, and D-Day officially made a hole in the Atlantic Wall, which made it much more doable for millions of Allied forces to then enter through this wall after D-Day, making it easier and easier and easier for more Allied troops to liberate France and surrounding areas. It did come at a great sacrifice. In that one day, 9,000 Allied troops were killed or wounded on D-Day. However, a turning point in World War II. Thanks for listening, you guys.